Welcome. We're going to begin in just a minute. Welcome to today's National Archives Know Your Records program, the second of a two-part series entitled Accidental Genealogy. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney, and we are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who were here yesterday, pardon the repeat of instructions. I'm going to go over how you can best participate in today's event. For those of you who have joined us on site, if you have questions, we ask that you save them for the very end and come to the microphone in the aisle so that the online audience can also hear you. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, welcome back. You can also submit questions on this YouTube web page by first logging in and then typing your questions into the chat feature, and I'll ask those questions for you at the end of the program. You will also find a couple of links on this web page. One will take you to live captioning, and the other will take you to the presentation slides if you want to download them. So today, Ray Bottorff Jr. continues his genealogy presentation about sources accidentally found in our collections. Today is a focus on Selective Service System records. Mr. Bottorff joined the National Archives in 2010 as an archives technician and worked in the research and microfilm reading room at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. In 2013, he transferred to the textual processing section in College Park, Maryland, and later became an archivist in 2014. Ray's hometown is Detroit, where he spent 20 years in various customer service roles for Guardian Alarm and Chrysler Financial. He graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drawing in 1990 and earned a Master's of Arts in History, along with a Certificate of Archival Administration in 2009 from Wayne State University in Detroit. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Ray Bottorff Jr.
Thank you again, Andrea. Appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who has come and all the folks online. I hope your day has been a good one. And welcome to day number 2 for Accidental Genealogy. I hope you come away with some new things. I've been told yesterday a lot of people discovered a lot of new things, and hopefully that happens again today. My focus today is going to be on the Selective Service System, or as I jokingly call this thing, how I learned to stop worrying about the draft let me try that again. Oh, how I learned to stop worrying and love the draft. Genealogist remix. And basically, we're going to cover one particular record group today. And that record group is record 147, which is the records of the Selective Service System. Now, people are familiar with the Selective Service System from genealogical research because of some of the stuff that is available to them right now. People are familiar with the predecessors to the Selective Service System, which created the draft registration cards of the First World War. They're also familiar with draft lists from the Civil War, and there have been other historical attempts at drafts during the course of American history. For World War II era, most folks are familiar with what is called the Old Man's Draft, or the Fourth Draft Registration, which took place in April 1942. And that particular draft has been available online for quite some time now, primarily because, well, it's dealt with pretty much the same people who registered for that draft registered for World War I's draft as well. So that information, since the participants of that draft were old enough, it pretty much fell outside the purview of most privacy concerns for a long time. And so that information became available to the public a lot sooner than other draft information did. As far as the rest of the draft registration cards of World War II, there's several reasons why a lot of that information is not really available currently to the public. And first of all, it's all been regionalized. meaning that if you're looking for the draft registration cards for, let's say, South Carolina or Alabama or Florida, you have to go to our Atlanta location. Or if you are looking for Michigan or Wisconsin, you have to go to the Chicago location. And because they're regionalized, it makes it a little bit more difficult to get to in kind of one lump sum. They've also been held back because of privacy concerns until very recently. They've not been microfilmed. They're the original cards. And also the sheer volume, the sheer size of all the number of cards. Approximately 35 million men registered for the draft between 1940 and 1946. That's a lot of cards. And so it takes some time to get that stuff organized for people. Right now, there are efforts underway to digitize these records, and many of our regional facilities are currently in the process to do so. And then once those are digitized, they will eventually be indexed for the public to be able to look through and be able to discover their ancestors, or in particular, usually their fathers and grandfathers in this case. But there is an alternate set of records that are available, and they're called draft registration lists, and that's what I'm going to talk about quite a bit here today. Now, draft registration lists, basically, these are lists that were put together by the draft boards, and they were created during the course of the lifetime of the draft. And what kind of happened to them is that in 1945, the Selective Service System found itself in a little bit of a quandary. They had warehouses and warehouses full of records that they had maintained during the course of the war, and they had to dispose of those records. They had to do something with them. Basically, they purged all the records that were no longer deemed necessary for the day-to-day operations of things, and they began a major microfilming effort to digitize everything else to help to microfilm everything. Well, digitization is not the right word. To microfilm everything to make sure that this stuff is available and basically taking up less space than what they were using right at that point in time. In 1947, the Selective Service System became the Office of the Selective Service, and pretty much this was not an active agency anymore. The Selective Service draft was ended. It was basically a warehousing agency. The entire purpose of it was strictly to maintain the records and not really actively do anything with them. Basically what ended up happening, that didn't last very long. By 1948, the Cold War, it pretty much brought back the Selective Service System. And as a result, they began, once again, collecting information on potential draftees, which they do to this day. I'm going to talk about some of the records that are available to researchers now in the Selective Service System. There are a certain amount of records that have been processed and are available to use by researchers. And what I mean by process means is that the records have been taken out of their original housing and have been indexed and categorized and create finding aids for and placed into archival boxes, meaning that they're able to be researched by researchers. During the efforts by the Selective Service folks and their microfilming, they already created a bunch of series that are available to you today. The first, second, and third national draft lotteries covering 1940 to 1942 are available, both on microfilm and in their original textual documents. There's also records related to conscientious objectors. The case files for registrants appealing to the president from 1940 to 1947 is currently available to researchers to view. There are also other conscientious objective records. There are the docket books of the Presidential Appeal Board. These are the folks who appealed to the president for their conscientious objector status. And there are also records of the Amnesty Board cases of 1946 and 1947. The records were compiled during that time period, but the actual cases might predate that time period into the war era. But there is one series that did come up that I felt was the creme de la creme of the draft registration list. And pretty much this is kind of like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow as I was looking through it when I first discovered it. And the series is called and bear with me for this long title, it's the Records Related to Local Board and Overseas Registration Lists, Registration Delinquencies, Appeals, Canadian Students, Foreign Nationals, Historical Files, policy files, and Americans serving with co-belligerents 1940 to 1947. Now, that's a very lengthy title. The main reason why it's such a long title, it has not been processed. It's still in its original boxes. And it consists of approximately 1,016 and 35 millimeter microfilms that were originally photographed from 1945 to 1947. And they were boxed up by the Selective Service folks and sent to the Federal Records Center in 1971, and eventually got accessioned to the National Archives in the 1990s. Why has the series been kind of forgotten all this time? Pretty much the series is basically disorganized. It's the boxes, the microfilm reels are just packed into the boxes. The boxes themselves are dusty and dirty from all the years they have been in storage. There are no duplicate copies of these reels yet, none available to the public as it stands right now. These are the original microfilm. And most of the reels themselves are on 70-year-old metal microfilm reels, which I discovered when I worked them. Very hard to use in modern microfilm equipment. So you can a lot of times scroll through the microfilm, but you find it almost impossible to rewind it. It makes it a little bit difficult to view, especially if you're looking through multiple reels. But maybe part of the problem might be that for close to 20 years, it was titled something that no one would ever want to look at. And this is the series title for this series for 20 years. And as a result, no one, until I looked at it from the time it was accessioned to the National Archives. I mean, this would scare anybody away. There's no definition whatsoever what these records were until you actually pulled the microfilm boxes out to actually look at them, and it would scare just about anybody else away. And is it a diamond in the rough? Probably. You could make some argument very strongly that perhaps one of our digitalization partners could consider this series for potential digitalization. Now, the draft registration list, the vast bulk of the microfilm covers DSS forms 3, 3A, and 3B. And these are basically draft registration lists from the local draft boards across the United States. Forms 3 and 3B are called lists of registrants to local draft board, and Form 3A are the duplicate lists of registrants. Form 3 lists the draft order and serial numbers, the full name of the registrant, the registrant's permanent mailing address, and their race. And then Forms 3A and 3B also include the same information as Form 3, but also adds things like the registrant's date of birth. And here's an example of one that I took, of Form 3, that I took from Summit County, Akron, Ohio, local board number 3, from October 1940. And you can see on this particular list the full name of the registrant, first, middle, and last, the address, and as well as the race of the particular registrant for the draft. Another example, this one dated from October 30th of 1940, same information. Pretty straightforward, and I like the fact that it also includes middle names, which is something that's, for example, you won't even find necessarily on census lists. This is an example of Form 3A, which comes from Placer County, Auburn, California, local board number 30, dated April 1942. And you can see the same information, name, address, race, also date of birth, the full date of birth of that particular individual. Towards the end of the Second World War, a variant of Form 3 and 3A was used called 3B. And 3B had the exact same contents as 3A, except it was entitled List of Registrants instead of duplicate list. Here's an example of the same information, name, in this case, some very incomplete addresses, the race, birth date, coming from LaSalle County and Cotulla, Texas, September of 1944. As you can see, this stuff pretty much crosses the entire country. The draft boards were also responsible for keeping the draft classification status updated for potential draftees. They used a form called Form number 100, which was called the Local Board Action Report. And this particular form listed the order and serial number of the registrant, full name, mailing address, race, date of birth, and the change in the registrant's selective service status. This one here from Fargo, North Dakota, from January 1947, represents a time period as the draft is winding down. And you can see from this particular record a lot of folks being listed as discharged, as their time on the board or being on the board's list has expired, and they were no longer eligible to be drafted. Now, the Selective Service amongst these particular boxes also kept a lot of different specific records regarding specific persons or places of particular draftees. And they kept all sorts of cards and other things. And in particular, they also kept tabs on people, U.S. citizens, working or vacationing abroad. They also had to register with the Selective Service System. And I picked out these two examples because I found them extremely interesting. This is examples of the draft registration cards filled out at the U.S. Embassy in Geneva, Switzerland from November 1943. And it contains two very interesting folks. The first person listed on here is George Templeton Strong, Jr., the son of American composer George Templeton Strong, Sr., and he is also the grandson and the namesake of George Templeton Strong, the diarist who was quoted extensively in Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, for those who remember that. The next gentleman below him on the same list is Tracy Strong, Jr., and Mr. Strong is a fascinating individual who passed away only very recently. He went to Switzerland in 1940 to join something called the European Student Relief Fund. With the aid of this group, Strong worked out a plan to help students displaced by the war in France to continue their studies in Switzerland. And what this did was it resulted in saving dozens of Jewish children and teenagers from French concentration camps and their eventual transportation to German extermination camps during the early days of the Vichy French government. And taking a look at this, you can see their name, their address, their date of birth information, all available along with their signature as well as the person who was the counsel of the embassy as well. A very fascinating list to look through of American nationals living abroad. The reach of the Selective Service reached around the world, as it turns out. And this is an example of a registration card, DDS form IF, or 1F, I'm not sure which. It is from December of 1943, and it's filled out at the U.S. legation in Beirut, Lebanon. And here we have a gentleman by the name of Salim Yamin, that was born originally in Massachusetts, but he registered for the draft in Beirut, Lebanon. And on the back of his particular registration card, or in this case form, they called it a card, but clearly a form, you find his information about his race, his height, his weight, his eye color, hair color, and other physical characteristics as well. If you worked in the Canal Zone or other areas of importance to the United States, you may get a deferment, but they still kept track of you. And they kept their own, in the case of Canal Zone, they kept a separate listing of all those people working in the Canal Zone, working once again under Form 1F. When the work in the zone was completed, those registrants, local draft boards would be notified of their eligibility. And you could see the updates made to the cards when their status had changed. Those who were considered foreign nationals also registered with the Selective Service on the same Form 1F. These men were born in the United States but currently living in another country, similar to the previous cards that I showed. They maintain a separate card index for this, and basically the Selective Service record their full name, date, place of birth, and where they currently live and the location that they registered. So even though unlikely these folks would probably be drafted since they're overseas, they could be drafted in theory if need be. Now, this is funny. At this point, I kind of wanted to run the Dragnet theme, but unfortunately, it's a copyrighted song, and I don't think the archives could approve the use of it for this presentation. But it's kind of apropos with this particular list. Even if you were in prison, you do not escape the grips of the Selective Service. The good folks here in the federal penitentiary and in Washtenaw County in Milan, Michigan, here on July 1945, well, they also were part of the draft registration tracking. In this particular sheet, you see the sentencing date, the induction date, the dates of those that were released from custody, those inducted for non-combat service, and those inducted through other means. All kept track of as well. Even if you were in prison, the Selective Service was looking out for you. For those who were engaged in non-combat services, including things like the American Field Service, they also kept track of that as well. And the American Field Service, for those who don't know, operated in war zones, driving ambulances and things like that for the evacuation of wounded individuals to hospitals. Basically, it lists the history of deferments, the name and address of the individual, and if they did no longer work this service, notify their local draft board once again that they're eligible for service. For those who know their history, Ernest Hemingway during the First World War served with the American Field Service. It was a way to get close to combat without actually being in combat for those who ended up doing this work. They also kept track of what they called Canadian students. And basically, it was a big, huge category that included people who weren't students. The Selective Service basically maintained a summary of all Canadians who lived in the United States, primarily to inform Canada that if they were eligible for their draft. Basically, it's listing what they did in the United States, what kind of work they were doing. In this particular example, you see on the card here, Louis Applebaum, who was a Canadian composer. And he was in the United States because he created the musical score to the movie G.I. Joe. And in this case, though, the person at the Selective Service misidentified the card and the movie as P.I. Joe for some reason. Resident aliens, another group that were kept track of by the Selective Service. Basically, they kept a running index of correspondence concerning resident aliens with other federal agencies like the State Department or Immigration and Naturalization. Here's an example of tracking the correspondence records involving those of Japanese ancestry. And you can see maybe a couple correspondence, but some folks had a lot of correspondence done about them. I ran across one that I thought was very interesting. And this particular resident alien was Vladimir A. Posner of New York City. Now, if you are thinking the name Posner sounds familiar, it should be. He is the father of journalist Vladimir V. Posner, and I'm not going to pronounce his middle name, who is best known for his television appearances during the 1980s representing and explaining the Soviet Union to audience in the United States. He also did, for a brief time, a show with Phil Donahue, if I remember correctly. Vladimir A. Posner left New York in 1946 and was starting his journey that would eventually take him to the Soviet Union. And he left just in time, as it turned out, because at the same time, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, began to investigate him. And when the Soviet Union fell in the 1990s, the KGB archives were opened up, and it was discovered that he did indeed have connections with Soviet intelligence. And he was being tracked by the Selective Service folks. Selective Service also tracked folks who served with what they called co-belligerents. And co-belligerents were those nations allied with the United States, like Canada, Great Britain, or China or France. And they kept track of all American citizens that served in the armed forces. It was Form 500 that it was called. It was called the Certificate of Enrollment, and Form 501 called the Certificate of Separation. And it chronicled U.S. citizens serving in and discharged from Allied forces. The vast majority of Americans on these lists served with the Canadian Armed Forces. And the list itself wasn't created or started to be created until 1942. So sometimes it could list people who had served in the Canadian Forces up to as old as 2 years prior, who may have served in 1940 or 1941 and has since been discharged in some fashion or another. But still, nonetheless, they kept track of those folks. Also, the Certificate of Separation includes, if you look very carefully at the top of it, and I'll show you the example here, the date the local board was informed that this person was now eligible for draft service. These two particular examples you can see were two gentlemen who were discharged from the Canadian Army due to misconduct and desertion. Both cases, they list the name, address, where they served. They also notates that in this case, as you can see, when they served and when the information was recorded by the Selective Service. And you can see at the top where that ADV is, that means advised, and that's when the local board was notified. This particular person was eligible for U.S. service. In these records also included members of the local boards that served themselves. They kept track of those people who had served with the local draft boards. And here's an example of form number 23, appointment orders and acceptances, which basically chronicles the president's appointments to local boards. Here's an example of Jose Rodriguez, who accepted an appointment to a local board number 1 as a government appeal agent in Jerez, Puerto Rico from February 1942. Also, there's form number 7, which is the recommendation for an uncompensated personnel action. This was used to either recommend an appointment or termination of an unpaid local board volunteer. This here is particular one is a recommendation for James McLeod of Grafton County, Littleton, New Hampshire, working local board number 5 to replace a member of local board number 3 in nearby Woodsville in August 1946. They also kept track of the individuals themselves, uncompensated personnel, and basically volunteers doing many types of jobs for the local board, and I have 2 examples here. On Form AD-8, track the personal actions of these volunteers, their full names along with the time period they served. And as you can see, there's their appointment date, their end date, their name, and even if they received a certificate of appreciation from the board. This is an example from local board number 19 of Jefferson County, Alabama. One form covers examining physicians, and the other one covers re-employment committeemen, all of which were last updated at the end of everything in 1947. Now, in this particular series, the Selective Service also microfilmed the local board case files for New York City. This seems to be unusual because I've not seen any other examples where other local board case files were saved. Just for some reason, New York City's was. And basically, these were the case files of those who failed to report for examinations or inductions. Not all would be obviously prosecuted. A lot of times it was just a mistake of something that happened that needed to be cleared up. The only drawback to this particular set of microfilm, it may contain 70-year-old Social Security numbers, which may be publicly available, but may also possibly require some measure of screening before that they can be viewed. And I'm going to tell you a story, or in this case, the case of Walter Alfred Goldstein. Mr. Goldstein had a little adventure with the Selective Service folks during the course of World War II, and I'm going to kind of run through his case file with you to kind of give you an idea of the things he had to go through, and same thing with the board itself, what they had to go through in order to have his matter taken care of. Here's an example, the original cover sheet that was on his case file, and you can see all the crossed off and all the stamped stuff reflecting all the changes in status over the course of several years. In March of 1942, Mr. Goldstein fills out his original supplemental questionnaire for his local draft board. And basically, this is in addition to the original questionnaire that everybody filled out. And more than likely, it was used for those folks who were applying for a deferment of some type. This particular listing includes the name, address, members of his family, even information on his rent. In the statements of the registrant, which he also filled out, he informs them of his current occupation, which is as a merchant seaman oiler. This particular list also lists the name, address, his occupation, his education level, and even his physical condition. Starting in January 24th, 1943, Mr. Goldstein started, stuff started happening to him with the local draft board. And he received, or he got sent out to him anyways, a notice of delinquency, basically indicating that he had failed to show up for physical inspection for potential induction. By October of 1943, a full report of delinquents to the United States District Attorney report was sent out to local prosecutors for possible legal action. You notice that the form reports Mr. Goldstein received his notice of delinquency on May the 11th, 1942 originally, so it appears that the 1943 notice was not the only one he received. On this particular form, it gives, very interestingly enough, gives his physical appearance information to the local district attorney. And that is done because in case they have to issue a warrant for his arrest. It gives the district attorney information to possibly pursue any sort of arrest warrant against him. On December 15th, 1943, he receives an order, or order was sent out to him, an order report for induction. And so he got the official notice that he had to report for induction. But wait, here comes a telegram. The records have a telegram indicating that all the way from Wilmington, California, and later correspondence with this telegram, dated December 18th, 1943, by the Recruitment and Manning Organization of the War Shipping Administration, confirming that Mr. Goldstein remained a merchant seaman. The central office in Washington, D.C., as is noted on the telegram, would send the correct information to the local board. And here's the letter. They did do that as well, even though they misspelled his name slightly. And where did the confusion come from? Well, as it turned out, Mr. Goldstein had forgotten to notify the New York local draft board of his and his family's change of address. On January 11th, 1944, the form Request for Transfer for Delivery was submitted, confirming that Mr. Goldstein and his family now called Los Angeles home. But it's not done yet for him. On August 10th, 1944, the New York Local Board number 20 once again sends out a letter to the Merchant Marine Deferment Section advising them that Mr. Goldstein was overdue for refiling his deferment paperwork. An affidavit then is sent, Occupational Classification General, from the Merchant Marine Deferment Section of the War Shipping Administration in Washington, D.C., arrived at the local board on February 5th, 1945, and confirmed that Mr. Goldstein's occupation and importance to the war effort still remain the same. And finally, it was over. On February 6, 1945, Mr. Goldstein's file was effectively closed as local board number 20 of New York City advises him that he is now classified 2B, no longer eligible for drafting. And what makes this kind of interesting, this entire case file, is that by using these Selective Service records, you could tie it into existing records that already exists, both online and also available here at the archives, either in Washington or College Park, or even at our regional archives for that matter. And I'm going to show you something that was, we're going to meet Mr. Goldstein actually. We're going to show a picture of him. And so this will be him. And here he is. This here is from the applications for Seaman Protection Certificates and related records from here at Archives 1 here in Washington, D.C. And it shows how records, from here can relate to the Selective Service records. And in this particular case, here he is from 1936, his picture, 6 years prior to his run-in with his Selective Service folks. Even his fingerprint, and which kind of documents his start of his life as a seaman and how he continued through the war. Yeah, it's currently digitized and available, as well as Ancestry.com if you want to look up and meet Mr. Goldstein or anybody else for that matter in seaman certificates. Now, I contend that the Selective Service records, especially the draft registration lists, are arguably the best untapped source of genealogical information currently available at the National Archives of College Park, Maryland. Frankly, I encourage those in the genealogical community and digital partners with the National Archives to consider these records for both future research and digitalization. There is a wealth of information to be found and insight about the lives of the men of draft age in and outside the United States during the Second World War. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, everything that I've talked about the last 2 days. As I said at the beginning, the more you learn about your ancestors' past, the greater chance that will lead you to other records in the National Archives. And you just might find answers to your questions if you're willing to explore for those answers and look a little hard for them. This here for the last 2 days is what my colleagues and I accidentally discovered. And I ask you, what accidental genealogy will you find? And I thank you very much for attending for these past 2 days. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. That was wonderful. So this is Andrea's disembodied voice speaking. I have a question for you. As you were going through today's slides and you have all these wonderful images, I was wondering if what you have up there for images accurately reflects the quality of those records, because some of them were kind of faded and I thought maybe hard to read.
You will find issues of fading on some of the documents that were microfilmed. I got the impression because that they were literally microfilming millions of pages of documents, and they did it in such a short period of time, that the quality control level might be a little weak on some of it. Unfortunately, since it's on film and the original documents were long since destroyed, I think you're going to unfortunately have to deal with those documents that may not be crystal clear. Most of what I saw could be viewed and you could figure out pretty much what was being said. If you use some modern microfilm equipment, in the case of stuff that may be too dark or too light, you can probably bring out the image better. But what you pretty much see is what you're going to pretty much get with these microfilm items. Okay,
fair enough. Thank you. We had a question that came in at the very beginning of your presentation because you did 2 parts. This actually goes back to yesterday's talk about the railroad strike. So she asked, if we know the name of the railroad our relatives worked for, are there finding aids that would help us locate what part of the records we should look at?
Not yet. That series in particular has not been, as they say, processed, which means that they are still in their original containers. So unfortunately, you would have to, there's not many containers, fortunately. I think there was, if my memory serves me correctly, only a handful of containers. So you would have to look through them to find your particular railroad. They are, though, organized by railroad. They're kind of organized by area, actually, if my memory serves me correctly. So you should be able to find them fairly easily once you find that particular railroad in question as you go through them. In other words, you're not going to have one sheet with one railroad and another sheet of another railroad and so forth like that. They're all grouped together by railroad.
That's helpful. Thank you. Do we have any questions from our on-site audience while you ponder that and make your way to the microphone? Looks like I have a question here. Let's see. I had asked a question yesterday regarding cousin missing in action in Korean War. Ooh, she says she didn't hear the answer because her husband was talking.
My apologies.
So do you mind repeating?
If you can refresh the question, yeah.
The question was, I actually have it here from yesterday. Let me go down, and she says, oh, maybe I don't, but it was in the Korean conflict, could you find a relative? Phyllis, if you could ask that question again, we'll be happy to answer it. I can't find it at this point.
In a general broad sense, the first place I would recommend contacting would be the Service Personnel Center in St. Louis for any information on any individual soldier, sailor, or airman. The problem is that the Korean War era records, particularly for Army records, suffered heavily due to the 1973 St. Louis fire. So there's always the potentiality that information might not be available. I think it was also about POWs and MIAs. She also should probably want to talk to a military archivist here in College Park. The military archivist would know better about POW and MIA records related to the Korean War, and more than likely there's going to be documentation of some type here at the archives about that.
Thank you for going over that again for us. Do we have any more questions from our online audience or from folks here in Washington, D.C. in the theater with us? Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. You did a very thorough job. And so I'm going to make my way up there and wish everybody well. Oh.
Well, I want to thank all the people who actually watched me this past couple of days and who continue to watch the presentations. Thank you very much. I appreciate all those in attendance as well who came here to view me. Yeah, please feel free. I will probably check the page every now and then on YouTube, so if you have further questions, feel free to ask them there. I just might respond to you.
Thank you for that offer, Ray. I'd also like to add, if for some reason you have an additional question or any kind of question that's research related, you can always submit it to us via email on inquire@nara.gov. And so feel free to send that, and if we get something for Ray, we can forward it along to him. So thank you for joining us for today's presentation. I'd like to thank our presenter, Mr. Bottorff, for joining us. Thank you for the audience and for our audiovisual staff. And I'd also like to thank our captioner, Ann Louise Seaman. Thank you for doing a great job for us. Thank you, and hope to see you again.